I'm Barry Tramel with the Oklahoman. 25 years ago this winter, I took an unforgettable trip. I went a week with Scott Hill, then the Oklahoma football recruiting coordinator. We went all over the country as Scott recruited players to come to the University of Oklahoma. Today, Scott Hill joins me. We're going to reminisce a little bit about that trip that I'll never forget, that includes some names you will most definitely remember. Scott, thanks for joining me. And let's give the itinerary. We left here on a Monday, flew to Dallas, Texas. You chatted with Lonnie Finch and Mark White, a couple of guys from the Dallas area who signed with OU. On Tuesday morning, we flew to Indianapolis, Indiana, chatted with Kenny McMitchell's family. Kenny eventually signed with Oklahoma. Wednesday morning, flew to Newark, New Jersey. Scott chatted with Kenny Sally, a highly recruited defensive back who was committed to OU, ended up signing with South Carolina. Scott has never forgiven me for that one. Thursday morning, we fly to Seattle, Washington, chat with a Parade All-American safety, Scott Thompson, who did sign with the Sooners, and that night flew to Los Angeles. Had dinner with a guy maybe you've heard of, Jamel Holloway. Certainly a memorable trip for me. And Scott, first question for me is, 25 years ago, whatever made you let me go with you? Why did you ever decide to let me make that trip with you?
You know what, Barry, back then it was a lot different. You know, we used to talk to the press and let the press in on them, and even let you guys help us find out where guys were leaning at the last 2 or 3 weeks of the year before signing date, so we could put more pressure or get Coach Switzer there for the last time to see him. So a lot of difference back then, a lot more fun, and you know, it really wasn't any bother. Coach Switzer was fine with it. You were always you're not going to say anything we asked you not to say, and so it seemed like a fun thing to do, and it ended up being a fun thing to do. I'm glad to be here and talk about it 25 years later.
Do you, you know, I could tell on that trip how much you enjoyed the interaction with players and parents. Do you miss recruiting?
You know, I miss recruiting more than I miss coaching. I was more of a recruiter, and I coached the running backs there in the last 5 years I was there, but I was always on the road Thursday through Friday, regardless of where we were playing. And then I enjoyed, just like you said, going in, meeting the coaches, going in, meeting the players, developing relationships, maintaining the relationships. Back then we didn't have texting, we didn't have computers, and so it was all phone conversation. And then we could see the kids as many times as we wanted to during the course of the week after their season was over. So getting to know them back then was a lot easier and a lot more fun.
I have no idea how much of the details of that trip you remember. Thing that sticks out on me, on Monday night, we go to Lonnie Finch's house, and his mother and father were there. His dad didn't say a word, but his mother grilled you. Now, she was a little fireball, and she was interested in what was going to happen to her son, mainly about academics. How often did that happen, that you were sort of put on the defensive rather than you try to sell them? You were sort of on the witness stand.
You know, part of recruiting was figuring out which parent or uncle or brother or who was going to be, you know, the alpha of the decision-making process. And once you figured that out, you could play to them and generally have a pretty good chance of helping them along, figuring out exactly what their buttons were that you needed to push and so forth. You know, Mrs. Finch, as a lot of mamas were, it was getting down close to signing date, obviously, and a lot of times it got down to that. You know, just really haven't been quite as aggressive, Coach Hill, as I wanted to be. Now let's get down to brass tacks. He's thinking about going up there. I want to find out what's really going to take place. So I got that a lot.
Well, the next night, far different. We went to Kenny McMitchell's house. Kenny came from a very poor background. If I remember right, his father was incapacitated to some degree, crippled, or I can't remember what, but you know, I remember leaving that house, and I said, Scott, they didn't ask you near as many questions as Lonnie Finch's mom. And you said, you know what's sort of sad is they just didn't know what to ask. That was clearly a case of a guy had been put into a situation where he was sort of out on his own. How often did you come across that?
Came across that quite a bit too. But again, I remember Kenny, the coach, was the key in Kenny. And when we talk about Kenny Sally here in a minute, we'll be able to say the same thing. But the coach for Kenny McMitchell was really the key in that recruiting process. The parents had let Kenny use the coach sort of as a mentor, and I thought that deal was probably already done when we got there as far as being able to sign Kenny. And that's just another side. You had to figure out who was the most important person in that kid's life, going to help them make the decision. That was the coach there in Kenny's situation.
Well, the next day we went to New Jersey, and we went to a Kenny Sally who was actually on the high end of OU's wish list, a parade All-American, a fabulous player. We go to Morristown, New Jersey, and you get to his high school and you can't find Kenny Sally. The coach wants to talk to you and basically says, you know what, I think the kid's going to go to South Carolina. Joe Morrison's the coach. He's a friend of mine. I think he'll take better care. I know I'm not saying anything bad about you, Scott Hill, said the coach.
I understand.
But he said, I know Joe Morrison's going to take care of him. You were completely blindsided, never saw that coming. How often did you get such a such a curveball?
At such late in the recruiting process, not very often. Generally, you'd be able to get some sort of idea of what was going to take place, but that one certainly was. I thought Kenny Sally was coming to Oklahoma. I'd already on our board on Sunday after we'd gone, I had put him up on our board as one that was going to commit to us that week and come. And Coach Proctor, I remember, was really excited about that because Kenny would have been quite a catch for us and the first really good player from New Jersey that we'd sign. And have an opportunity to sign one player in an area, generally you can go back and get more. So I was very disappointed and shocked. The coach never had been quite that outgoing, let's say, to me. So I was shocked at that.
Obviously, everybody else we saw on that trip signed with OU, so you saw them soon enough. Did you ever maintain a relationship with guys who didn't sign with you or stay in contact with them, or do you just have to cut the ties? And do you even know whatever happened to Kenny Sally?
No, I don't. I don't know what happened to Kenny Sally, and I'll be honest with you. I don't know that if I could sit here right now and give you a name of any of the players that I was recruiting that did not come to Oklahoma that I still have a relationship with. Now, I've got a relationship with several players that came to Oklahoma and then left for one reason or another. Glenn Milburn and Tyrone Rogers are great examples. I talk to them on a regular basis. But players that you signed and recruited and actually didn't sign to come, I don't have much relationship with any of them, if any.
Well, on Thursday morning of that memorable week, we flew cross country, Newark to Seattle, still the longest time I've ever spent in an airplane. Got there early enough to have lunch in Seattle because of the time change. Went and saw Scott Thompson, who was a parade All-American safety. His parents had actually moved away from Seattle, and he was staying with a coach. He really didn't recruit the parents at all. You were just dealing with mainly Scott. Scott signed and really never panned out as a player. Stayed and was on the team, but just never became a great player. How often did you miss on a player like that?
Well, I think after you and I talked the other day, I went back and looked at some of the older players that I signed or recruited and signed, and I didn't miss on many, but there was probably 2 a year. I think when we went through that list there, Mark White left, and then Scott obviously didn't become the player we thought it was going to. So there's 2 out of the 8 that I signed. So I figure that's probably a pretty good percentage.
Is part of it just a case of numbers that you signed all kinds of great. Lonnie Finch did play. Mm-hmm. Kenny McMitchell did play. That's 2 of 4 defensive backs right there that you need. I mean, sometimes there's just not room for guys. Well,
that's right. And they come in, they compete, and they're competing with 4 classes. And then every time you graduate a class, you got another freshman class that comes in, and the attrition rate hits them a little bit. But those players that are the better players, they just move out of that arena of high school into college, and they are the better players or they're not. You still got to have second and third team players and special team players and so on and so forth. So you got to have the numbers, but you certainly miss on some.
On Thursday evening, we flew to Los Angeles in time to have a late dinner with Jamel Holloway. Now, let me just say this. Until October of 2009, I had lobster once in my life. And that was with Scott Hill in Los Angeles over dinner with Jamel Holloway. I remember the lobster being fantastic, and I remember Jamel Holloway being a very interesting young man. In the winter of 1985, you guys were recruiting Eric Mitchell from over in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Everybody in Oklahoma knew all about Eric Mitchell, thought of him as the great next Oklahoma quarterback. But there was this kid in Los Angeles that you coaches had spied and said, this guy can be something special. When did you know that Jamel Holloway was going to be something special?
The previous year, I saw him play as a junior in a playoff game. We'd recruited Stanley Wilson and John Truitt from the same high school down there, so I went to Banning High School every year from that point on looking for players. So when John Truitt, I believe, was a senior, Jamel was either a sophomore or junior, and I saw him play, and I came back then and said, if we ever have a chance to get Jamel Holloway, he'll really be a good player for us. And he was poised. He was very poised, a high school football player. He threw the ball really well for an option quarterback, and he really had a good grasp on the option part of the football. So I knew he was a good player 2 years before we actually got to recruit him.
Now, Jamel Holloway was, what's the right word I want to use here? I'd say worldly is a good use of the term. After visiting guys like Lonnie Finch and Kenny McMitchell and people like that who had really been pretty sheltered and really not all that savvy in the ways of the world, Jamel Holloway, he knew a lot more about what was going on than I did. And at the time, was Jamel always that sort of? He just seemed like he was very mature, but also sort of an operator. I mean, he knew the score, I think, is what the deal was with Jamel Holloway.
Well, he's a very good con guy, no doubt about that. Very smart, and he might not have applied his intelligence to the right place at all times, but he certainly had a lay of the land, and he was street smart. You know, a lot of the California guys were way ahead of some of the other kids all across the country just for that reason. They'd been exposed to a lot more environmental issues than some of the other kids. But Jamel, even at that point, was way ahead of everybody else. He knew how to communicate. He looked people right in the eye. And also, Jamel had a goal, whether he could have actually articulated it at that point or not. Jamel had a goal of what he wanted to accomplish and felt like he was good enough to do it, and expressed that in private moments when I was recruiting him.
This was in late January, maybe early February of 1985, and of course 11 months later he's quarterbacking you to the national championship over Penn State. Scott, before we went on that trip, you made a statement to me. You said one reason you wouldn't mind me going or would even like for me to go is you wanted everybody to know how you recruited and how you operated and what you did. You wanted yourself to be an open book. Did you find that kind of openness was beneficial in your efforts as a recruiter?
Absolutely, I did. I thought, there's several different people that were involved in the press back then that I was good friends with and still good friends with to this day. And I really, back then, we didn't have all the magazines, we didn't have Rivals.com, we didn't have all of those things, so you had to use other avenues to get the information that you can get just go punching a couple buttons now. And by being open and visiting with Artie Gigantino and Glenn Rush and Vinny Serrata, those guys, we had a little group of some of the bigger schools. We would talk and actually say, we're really going hard after this kid. And a lot of times we would back off of him. If USC said, I'm going after that running back, sometimes, I think I told you the other day, the other schools other than Oklahoma, UCLA, and USC, I'd back off if USC was really putting the pressure, and because there was 4 more out there that I could go and recruit and have a chance to sign.
Well, it certainly was a memorable trip for me, and I've never forgotten it and used it many times as I've surveyed the landscape of college football. Scott, I hope I thanked you back in 1985, but let me thank you again, because you certainly didn't have to do that, and I appreciate what you did for me.
Well, the thank you is mutual, and I appreciate you going, and it's been a lasting relationship.
It has. Thanks a lot. Stay tuned for more Oklahoma football coverage on News OK, as well as every day in the Oklahoman.